Oh, wonderful. All right. Hi, everyone. So without further ado, I'm so sorry. I just took a couple extra minutes to get ready. But hi, so much. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Wonderful. Thank you
Good.
so much for taking the
Ha-
time to make to come out and talk to me today. I really appreciate it.
That's fine. I'm just shutting the window on your Twitch stream that I'd opened to see what was going on because I wondered if you'd forgotten me or something.
Yeah,
So
no worries. So I had
no
just like a
problem.
conflict in scheduling, but I looked at my phone and I saw that we had obviously the scheduled for tonight. So let me go ahead and just adjust my Twitch title. Christine
Okay, you're
Burns.
slightly quiet to me, so let's see if I can do the volume here somewhere. No, no, that's my maximum volume now. So
Let's see, and we'll make this just chatting. Yes, there we go. All right, wonderful. So without, I want to be very conscious of your time. And obviously we also have someone. We have actually several interviews lined up for tonight, but I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about this because I've heard a little bit about your work and some of the things that you have done. But before we get too far ahead, people in my audience might not be aware of you. Could you introduce yourself and tell the audience a little bit about some of the work that you've done?
okay, well, where to start? My name's Christine Burns. I'm a retired British activist. I was one of the leaders of an activist group in Britain in the 1990s and in the noughties that you might have heard of called Press for Change.
Hmm.
We were the first and really principally only activist organisation in Britain at that time, and we sought to use strategic litigation, that is, to take legal cases which, if we won them, would give us leverage over government to create new legislation or to create case law, or as I think you call it, jurisprudence.
Hmm.
In fact, Press for Change was formed 29 years ago today. It's the organization's birthday.
Oh my God,
Um,
wonderful. Happy birthday. That's amazing.
Yes, I should have some candles, except that, of course, a Press for Change now has a sort of as passed. I retired from the organisation in 2007, and most of us were going away by that point because by that time we had achieved the goals that we had formed the campaign for.
Hmm.
And I think that's an unusual circumstance to get into as an activist. The thing that made us very effective was that we were very clear about what we were there to do. And the
Yeah.
thing that really pushed us was that we were aiming to achieve legal recognition for, in those days, transsexual people, but we tried to widen that to refer to trans people as far as possible.
Hmm.
And our means of doing that was cases that we took to the European Court of Human Rights, which is the European version of what took place in 1948 with the signature of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in the United Nations. I think that was Eleanor Roosevelt's work, actually.
Wow.
Um,
Yeah.
but in 1952, states of Europe, and obviously Europe was still recovering after the Second World War, they put together, I think, what they felt to be a rather more practical and implementable set of human rights principles,
Hmm.
a smaller set which left out some of the social objectives of the Universal Declaration. And a number of European countries signed that declaration in, as I say, 1952, and an organization that was set up then to form an international court,
Hmm.
which would hear cases from the member nations. And now I think there's something around about 40 member nations of what's called the Council of Europe. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked
Yeah.
because you're
No,
asking what I.
that's a wonder.
So
That's a lot of wonderful information. So trust me, I'm not objecting. I guess that the way that I want to tie this back in, because that's actually really interesting, because over in the US, we would probably call that, I'm not sure if you would call that over there, but we would probably call that impact litigation here, right? Like, where different interest groups take on specific cases trying to achieve a certain kind of like a political end, or get some kind of, in this case, like civil rights or equality, right? So we see a lot of that very similar over here, with various cases like, you have the ACLU doing large scale work across the nation. And then we have like smaller organizations, like one that I'm on the board of directors for. I'm on the board of directors for a smaller nonprofit in Maryland called FreeState Justice, and they do impact litigation work just at the state level. So it's actually, so hearing about kind of how that happens over in the UK is really interesting to me, because like law is very different here compared to over there. And so you have like very different means to have to navigate through that system. But I guess where I want to start is just like, so you said that you were part of this organization for a while. And so what I'm wondering is, like, how were you able to, like, how did the organization get started in the first place? Or actually, because I'm curious, like, do you have any kind of legal background, or were you able to form this?
No, I don't. But I always insist that I've spent so long immersing myself in legal cases and giving secondhand advice to people that I very often get taken for a lawyer. I just don't get the fees. That's all.
Oh,
but to
darn.
answer your question, I mean, I think we've got to go back a little bit further. Until about the mid 1960s, the stories of trans people in Britain, as I guess most other places as well, were about individuals, and usually people with positions of status, or their families had status, so that they could actually find the kind of specialist help that they needed. But there was no sort of concept of community. And what happened in 1966 was that a very small number of trans people got together, and the inspiration, in fact, was the, oh my God, I've forgotten the name of it. The organization that was set up by, oh God, she was a ophthalmologist, wasn't she, or a dentist? I can't remember. Who coined the word transgender?
Oh, okay.
Yeah, God, I'm sorry. I forgot to actually remind myself of how to talk about that.
You're
anyway,
fine. You're not being graded.
We formed I claim age now. We formed an organization that was centered on providing self-help support, called the Beaumont Society. And it was, as I say, it was modeled on the full personality expression, the Phi Pi Kappa or something, or Epsilon, or oh, never mind.
Oh,
anyway,
I'm not familiar with that. Could you explain briefly what that is?
There was an American group established in the early 60s, which was based around both a magazine and also help, which provided a center for people to be able to discover each other. And these people in Britain had formed a chapter of that in Britain, and then went on to create this Beaumont Society in 1966. And from there, you began to see that the flourishing of local self-help groups for trans people. But in 1969-70, there was a very famous divorce case of a trans woman, a socialite called April Ashley, who you probably have heard of. And she had married in the early 60s. She'd married a man who stood to inherit a massive fortune, a baronetcy as well.
I think I have heard of this case, but go ahead and keep explaining.
There's funny enough, actually, there's a case like this in many other countries as well. They married, the marriage didn't last. She wanted a divorce, but she also wanted alimony. And the family determined that the way to prevent her from getting alimony was to argue that the marriage had never existed, because in the eyes of the law, for the purposes of marriage, April was a man, and the Marriage Act of 1949 specified that marriage was between a man and a woman. Didn't define what a man and a woman was, but nobody thought they needed to define that in those days. So it ended up in court. It was decided, the judge himself came up with a test, which he was very pleased of himself with, to determine that April was for marriage a man, and so therefore there was no marriage, there was no alimony. Goodbye, April. And that was a real slapdown for trans people in those days, because until that point we never had any official rights in any laws, but there was an awful lot of what you could call grace and favour provision. Lots of people were able to get their birth certificates, or at least the register of births and deaths, annotated, and to receive corrected birth certificates as a result. Some people, like April, had used that to get married. Lots of people were settled down, quietly living their lives in stealth. And so what happened with the outcome of her case was all of that was ripped away, and the certainties that people had were gone. And what followed from there then was a succession of further blows. It wasn't long before other legal cases ruled that we couldn't actually have inconsistencies. We couldn't have one kind of law where somebody like April was a man and another kind of law where she was regarded as a woman. So it soon became accepted practice that for all purposes, trans women were, for the purposes of the law, the gender recorded at birth. And that stayed, in fact, all the way up until we passed the Gender Recognition Act in 2004. But what it meant was that nobody could actually figure a way of beginning to change that, because by that point, the press in Britain had decided that the place for trans people was to be outed in Sunday tabloid newspapers. That was our purpose in life. And people, that was the biggest fear that we all had.
Wait, why is there, you mean like there's a fear that trans people had, or like the public had a fear of trans people?
There was a fear that we trans people had, that if the press got onto you, then they would be relentless and you would find yourself on the front page of the scandal sheets on Sunday.
Gotcha.
Also, so the problems that we found ourselves in because of our legal lack of status, you couldn't go to the press with any expectation that they would help you, and you couldn't go to politicians because there's no votes in being associated with these weird people. Britain was still coming to terms with the fact that it decriminalised same-sex relationships between consenting males over the age of 21 in private in 1967. Until up to that point, men suspected of being homosexuals could be arrested and imprisoned. So we'd actually got past that in 1967, but there was still a lot of work to do socially to make same-sex relationships acceptable. And in fact, that took almost as long as our fight.
Yeah. I mean, or just to be able to comment on that, I mean, like, that's very similar over to here in the US, right? Like, we had, I mean, mind you, a lot of the conversations, like, a lot of, decriminalization of either sodomy or the legalization of same-sex marriage. A lot of these are very recent achievements. And obviously, this past summer, we had the Supreme Court case Bostock v. Clayton County come down for LGBT people and including trans people, which were wonderful victories. But obviously, like, here, the cultural, the kind of like what you said over in the UK, over in the US, like, a lot of the country is still very behind on these social issues, right? Even if the laws are, more and more catching up.
And you have the problem usually of having to do it 50 times over in different states, whereas at least if we're trying to change the law, we're only trying to change one law.
Must be
it's
nice.
not quite actually now, because actually now Scotland can actually have different laws to England, and Wales sort of has semi-autonomy as well. So it's still complicated, but it's nothing like as complicated as having a federal system. So as I was saying, that the position we were in the 70s, and there wasn't much information for any of this. The first time I saw a book by a trans person was in 1974, with the publication of a biography by a Times journalist called Jan Morris, who died a few months ago now. So her book was greedily gobbled up because it's the only information available. But all the way through the 70s and halfway through the 80s, people didn't think there was anything that could be done. And then in the mid 1980s, there was a trans man called Mark Rees, who he transitioned in 1972. He wanted to train as a priest, but of course the church regarded him as a woman, and in those days there were no women priests, so there was that was not open to him. And also, if he was to settle down, he would have wanted to settle down with a woman, but the law wasn't having that either, because in the eyes of the law he was a woman, so he was entitled to marry a man, but that was all. That was a tremendous irony. This guy, with beard and muscles and everything else.
Sure, yeah.
So anyway, he decided to take his case to the European Court of Human Rights, which I guess, a bit like trying to reach the Supreme Court, is a long and arduous journey, because you actually have to exhaust all the possible remedies in your own country first before you can apply for your case to be heard by the European Court of Human Rights. But he reached that status in 1986. And the thing that was significant about it was that the courts were listening. He had really good evidence of the detriments he suffered because he couldn't change his birth certificate to say he was born a boy or a man. He could show very good examples of the fact that that he was effectively unable to marry, and these are two key parts of the Convention on Human Rights. He didn't win. But he didn't. It wasn't really on the facts so much as the European Court has a doctrine, because it's actually got to hold all these different countries in the same basket. It's called a margin of appreciation, and the idea is that if a matter is settled among a considerable majority of the states making up the convention, then the laggard states will have cases found against them, because it's clear what the majority view is, and they need to catch up. But if something is regarded as not being settled law, then the state is allowed this margin of saying, okay, well, there's nothing to hold you to as a standard. And in Europe at the time, there were a number of countries that had moved legislation to provide for legal recognition and the ability to change your birth certificate. Germany, the Netherlands, Sweden. These weren't necessarily good laws. They were places where, in order to have legal recognition, you actually had to be proven to be infertile. They didn't want to have people being recognized as a new gender and then
right,
having babies or whatever. But at least they were laws. So as I say, he lost his case, but the thing was, he started a conversation, and what we were seeing at the time was, well, this is something different. This is something you can do. You can take a case to a senior court, and people will listen to your evidence. And courts don't do fake news. They don't do histrionics. They're interested in the facts. And if your facts are sound, then you stand some chance. And as it happened, about 4 years after him, there was an almost identical case, but involving a trans woman called Caroline Cossey, who was a model who worked under the name Chula. She was a hostess on a television program. She was famously featured in a number of big display advertisements, and she even had a part in one of the Bond films. And she was outed by the press, and she was engaged to be married, and her fiance ran away, faced with the puerile interest in her life. She lost her modelling contracts, and so she took her case to the European Court of Human Rights on the same basis that, without being able to change her birth certificate and be legally recognised, she had no recourse to private life, and she couldn't marry as a woman. So 4 years apart, the European Court heard two identical cases. That in itself was quite special, because usually if the European Court decided a case, that was it. Nobody else could bring anything like it. But they felt that this was an area where there were obviously severe privations for people, and still there was a lot of understanding yet to be achieved, and therefore they wanted to keep it open that people could come back. So what we took away from that, and the conversations that came out of it, was that there was some activism that could be done if we utilised the law, and that was the basis for setting up Press for Change. One of its founders, a colleague of mine, Stephen Whittle, had been training in law. He was by that point doing a master's. He's since gone on to be the professor of human rights law at one of the biggest legal departments in the country. And there were about 4 or 5 other people who were also in on that day in a tea shop in Westminster, and they decided to call it Press for Change. I got involved about a year later, and we really were sort of working this out as we went from scratch, because there's no rule book for how to do that kind of activism, and we had no money. We had very few resources, but we all had. This is a bit like Liam Nielsen saying, we have particular skills. I was an IT consultant. Stephen was a lawyer. We brought in fairly soon somebody who was an expert lobbyist. There's somebody else who's really good at organising things. Stephen's partner did the accounts. And then in about 1993 or 94, because of my work as an IT consultant, I was an early adopter of the web. And I saw this as a solution to some of the problems that we had in the early days, because we were trying to muster together trans people who were scattered around Britain, very isolated. You couldn't just ask people to come to a meeting in a given place, because that would have involved everybody having to travel. We couldn't often send newsletters out to them, because we had about 1,000 people on our list. But to send first-class postage to 1,000 people costs about £250, I guess $300. So it was very difficult to muster people together into a fighting force. And my colleagues said, when I said, look, we could do these things, I showed them about websites, and I showed them email and so on, and email discussion groups as well. And they were saying, well, that's all very well, Christine, but nobody can afford a computer. Everybody's very poor. And then about that time, along came the British equivalent of Donald Trump in terms of what was that show he used to do? The You're Fired show. Fun?
Is it The Apprentice? That's
The
the only show.
Apprentice, thank you. Yes.
Okay, yeah.
he produced a very cheap computer with his company called Amstrad, where you could buy an IBM PC clone for about £500, and that was affordable. And I then had the view that if we built this thing, people would come. So I started building a website, and I'd been to conferences in Europe in the early 90s, which had really lit the flame for me as an activist, because I'd grown up, as I guess we all had in those days, with what we were told we were, by whether it was by clinicians or by the press. And we were supposed to be ashamed, and we were supposed to regard ourselves as freaks, and we were very lucky to get whatever we got. And going to these conferences, I learned stuff that I never knew people knew. I was learning about the vagaries of endocrinology. I was learning all about intersex people. I was learning about the view of European lawyers who'd actually thought about these cases that had just been brought. And I realized that that had been transformative for me. So maybe if I presented this stuff to other people, it would be similarly consciousness raising. And we could be on the road to being able to get everybody talking from the same hymn sheet. Because if you're going to make people effective in a campaign, if you're just going to say, we want you to write this letter to somebody, you need people to understand the same logic as we did as leaders. So that's what I set out to do with the website. At the time, there were very few web pages of any kind that were trans-related on the web. I'm talking about 1994 and 95. There were a few individuals who tended to be, here I am, I'm a trans person, look, I'm not scary, don't be beastly to me. That was how they were using their web pages.
Okay.
There were organizations that had begun to use the web like a cheap form of brochure for whatever they did, because that was, corporately, that was the first approach to using the web in those days. But what we were trying to figure out was, this is incredibly powerful because we can reach people in seconds. We can change things in seconds. We can get stuff up. And that must be an effective tool. And in fact, the first chance to test it came along in 97, beg your pardon. We'd won a case in another European court called the European Court of Justice. And this gets people very confused because the European Union, which is a federation of states, has a commercial court which arbitrates, ensuring that all the states obey the same common laws of the EU. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit like, I think there are sort of corollaries with the US in that respect. Mm-hmm. And a case that we were involved in involved somebody who had been discriminated when their employer discovered that they were planning to transition. Okay. Up to that point, they had glowing references. They were going to be promoted. Then they said, I'm going to transition, and they were out the door the same afternoon. It was really, in terms of the injustice, an open and shut case. But we had a Sex Discrimination Act since 1975, but okay. Lawyers had argued that trans people weren't protected under that on the basis that the comparator, the Sex Discrimination Act, was to compare your treatment as a woman with the treatment a man would have got, or vice versa. And the argument of some beastly employers was that, the fact that we sacked this trans woman, we would have sacked a trans man in the same way. So there's no discrimination.
Interesting. I don't know.
You've got to love.
Well, I mean, just as a short comment, because I mean, I think that when we're talking about protections, on the basis of sex, it gets really interesting, because if you've been following, so I mentioned earlier, Bostock v. Clayton County over here in the U.S., our Supreme Court recently approached the same issue does that language, protection on the basis of sex, protect trans people? And I really like their argument, because essentially, if you haven't seen the language or like the court's opinion, essentially the conclusion they come to is that the only way that you could be able to discriminate a trans or an otherwise LGBT person on the basis of that aspect of their identity is if you take their sex into consideration, since that aspect of their identity usually relates to what in the public view would conceive of biological sex in some way or another, right?
Yeah.
With trans people, it's usually that they identify in some way contrary to how they were assigned at birth. And with people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, or otherwise have other forms of sexuality aside from straight, those people would be attracted to people that would be unconventional for what society would deem them to be according to like a biological sex category, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so I think but it's really interesting seeing how
that case in the Supreme Court is almost exactly mirroring the logic that was applied in the European Court of Justice in 1996. And I think it's also been applied before now. There was a case with was it the Library of Justice, I think, in one of the circuit courts a few years ago. And again, exactly the same argument was applied, that essentially, that being discriminated on the grounds of changing your gender, changing your sex, relies on the fact that it is a fundamental fact of having a sex. And ergo, it is sex discrimination on an aspect, because you were not conforming with the expectations.
Sure, like the gender typically associated with a biological sex category that society would ascribe you.
And that's very attractive, of course, because it also applies to any woman who's ever been sacked for not wearing heels or wearing the right kind of pencil skirt, and it applies. And I think I like the fact that Supreme Court has it's actually bundled up with an understanding that sexual orientation discrimination is wrong too. So I think you've got the two together. What we had, interestingly, was there were no discrimination rights for gay and lesbian people in the mid-90s. So when we won this case in the European Court of Justice, us four voluntary trans people working in our spare bedrooms, we had actually leapfrogged our bigger brethren in the lesbian and gay community. And this often happened, that the cases we brought actually opened up different forms of argument that you didn't get simply from looking at the lives of cisgender, lesbian and gay people. And what we tried to do with our cases was to argue them in such a way that if we won, then the finding was usable by the next sexual orientation case that came along as well. So we won that case, and it opened some doors for us to actually talk to government. But actually, before that, we had a new government in 1997, and they decided that they needed to create an amendment to the 1975 Sex Discrimination Act to import this European Court decision properly into British law. So they set out to stage a public consultation, but it was a dreadful consultation. They were arguing things like, should there be exceptions for, again, that don't protect trans people if they're working with vulnerable people or with children? The presumptions in there were vile.
Right. Assuming trans people to be in some way dangerous or like sexually deviant or something similar. Yeah. Still arguing against those today.
Absolutely. So things never change. So we got a copy of the consultation paper, and I think they were expecting this was going to be a quick formality. And I remember Stephen rang me at work, said this had arrived. I drove around to his college, met him at the curb. He handed me the papers. In those days, you didn't get these things as electronic files. They'd sent this thing in the post to us, and it'd taken 2 weeks to get to us, and we'd nearly run out of time. So I went home and I scanned it in, and then I proofread it, and then we put it up on the web, and we put out that night before I went to bed a call to action to all our new online followers, and said, look, you need to respond to this consultation individually. We're not going to tell you exactly what to say, because if we do, they'll spot that this is an organised response. We want you to say it in your own words, how you react to these proposals. And about a week later, we found from a friendly member of parliament asking questions that they'd received about 300 responses to this consultation, which they just hadn't expected. And it actually blew their process off the rails. They had to stop for a year to lick their wounds and work out how they were going to take this forward. So when they got back on the rails, we were able to say, no, we want to come in and see you. And that was my first experience of sitting in the office of a minister, arguing with her about what she was proposing. And in the end, we didn't get all the things we were after, but we at least made it a far better non-discrimination law than it would have been. And it also gave us the opportunity to say, look, there are other departments in the government we want to talk to as well. You've met us. We are honest brokers. We're all professionals. We know how to deal with you. We can work in confidence. Can we not work together on this stuff? So we were able to start developing a relationship with government, which came in really handy around about the millennium, when something we've been doing with a soap opera on television forced the government's hand into saying it was going to have a proper investigation into how it could deal with the transsexual problem of how to legislate for us. And we were involved in that. And then in 2002, we won our case at the European Court of Human Rights. These cases had kept going to the European Court, and each time the margin was getting smaller, and the court was getting more and more pissed off with Britain because the barristers were saying, look, it's frightfully complicated, old man, that we can't do this overnight, complicated issues, we've got to work them out. And they were blathering, and they've been blathering for 15 years. And by 2002, it was the largest collection of judges in the European Court that they could actually put together, 17. And they unanimously found against Britain. So the government was going to actually have to act now on having some kind of legislation to recognise our acquired genders. So that point, I remember it was about 3 days later, we got a call from a civil servant saying, could you come in and have a chat? And we went up to this very posh office in Westminster. I remember they got out the best crockery and the chocolate biscuits. I have a theory that when you're dealing with officials, you can tell where you are with them in terms of what sort of biscuits they serve. So if they serve just the really dry, cheap ones from the supermarket, you're at first base. But if they're bringing out these thickly enrobed chocolate, like the biscuits,
really good stuff.
Yes, yeah, you're in there.
Oh my God.
So we're then spending 2 years working back and forth with officials and ministers. I remember I used to get drafts of the Gender Recognition Act arriving at home, scribbled on the front said, "Read and eat."
Oh my God, that's amazing though that you were able to be that you got that involved in the process, and that you were able to push even at that point in the process that they were essentially looking to you for direct feedback on it.
Well, our position was that, look, we can save you getting egg all over your face, because we know what the complications are. Mm-hmm. And the argument also was that if you involve us from the very beginning, when we just got a blank piece of paper and we're putting down headings, then we can actually, if you involve us too late and the structure of the law is already essentially decided, then it's very difficult to make fundamental changes. But if we're involved in the rationale of, for instance, how will applications be decided? Would they be decided by somebody having to go to a court and appear before a judge? And we thought that was a really bad idea because it invited all sorts of differences depending on which judge you got, and there were privacy problems and there were subjectivities and so on. What we favoured was a purely administrative solution, which was, here's a form. If you fill it in and you provide all the evidence we're asking for, you've ticked all the boxes, then legal recognition should follow automatically. Mm-hmm. And certainly in the early days, we were getting something like 98% success rate on people's applications. So there were things that we didn't get that we wanted. For instance, there was the thorny problem of people who were already married when they had transitioned. And so legally recognizing the transitioned partner would create in law a same-sex marriage. And although...
would that nullify the marriage then?
Well, you're slightly ahead of yourself there.
Oh.
The government was also negotiating with the church on how to bring forward a form of legal recognition for same-sex partners. They didn't want at that point to call it marriage, but they were going to do civil partnerships. And the deal was that marriage was for heterosexual couples, and legal partnerships civil partnerships were for same-sex couples. So they feared that if they had this possibility in legal recognition for trans people that created a marriage where both partners were the same legal sex, then that would be a wedge, and the whole thing would come tumbling down. So they came up with the horrible idea that in order to have legal recognition in that case, that the partners would have to dissolve their marriage. And you think about that, I don't think there's anywhere in any civilized country where a government would insist on a happily married couple becoming unmarried. You make
right.
that vow in church about till death us do part. Nobody should come between you.
Yeah, it seems to go directly contrary to that. Yeah.
I mean, well, they tried to soften it by saying, well, 6 months after our Act of Parliament, there was going to be this Civil Partnership Act as well. And so people could dissolve their marriage, get legal recognition, and then immediately have a civil partnership. And if they timed it all well, then they could do it in the course of a day. Dissolve your marriage before lunch, and
dissolve your marriage before lunch and go off to the courthouse right after. That sounds great.
The extent they went to this. I mean, what I learned from this was I sitting there in a crisis meeting with the ministers, thinking at this point we could just get up and walk out and say, this is ridiculous, this is immoral. But at the same time, having a flawed Gender Recognition Act was better than having none.
Yeah.
And the experience of making big legal changes like this is that you don't always get what you want in one go. With the equalisation of the age of consent for same-sex and opposite-sex couples in Britain, it took 3 goes of changing the law to arrive at everybody being able to give consent when they're 16. So we sort of had to swallow that one and think, okay, we're just going to have to explain this to the folks back at the ranch when it comes out.
Yeah, that makes a little bit of sense to me insofar as, wait a second. Oh, I have the book behind me. So I've been reading a lot about, this doesn't necessarily apply over in the UK, but a really good book that other people should read, especially in the US, is on Lyndon Johnson, Master of the Senate, by Robert Caro. And essentially, a lot of the book follows how Lyndon Johnson while he did some decent things as a president, was especially well recognized historically as a senator. And the reason why was because he was able to essentially get the first major civil rights act, especially to address a lot of racism in our country, passed under situations where it was like almost politically, like most people consider politically impossible, right? Like there was an overwhelming majority of people who were in the Senate, or at least a large enough number of people in the Senate that were blatantly racist, right? And were very against any idea of civil rights. And so what he did, like he had a lot of really cool things that he did, and maybe I'll talk about it sometime with my own stream. But one of the things that he did was he was able to start by getting through an act which didn't have everything that he wanted initially, but his mentality was if they're able to get a bill in the door initially and they're able to show the public that like, hey, this is actually a good thing, then they can get public support to be able to pass further legislation down the line. And so that's what ended up being the precedent for a lot of other civil rights legislation coming down after. So that was really interesting. We only have a couple minutes, so I guess where I want to take this, because this has been a really cool conversation, but I think that's something that you mentioned that was really interesting to me earlier on, was kind of how you were able to take advantage of what the internet was starting out as and be able to use that to reach people. Obviously right now we are streaming live to Twitch, and there are lots of people in my Discord community. Like at this point, I'm looking, and I believe that we hit over 4,300 people in my community the other day, which is crazy to me. But I mean, like a lot of people online, I think still are struggling with how to be able to like take that, like that is something, like that means something, right? How to be able to take that and be able to engage in the same kind of political activism that you've done. So what would you say to the people who are primarily in online spaces who want to be able to get involved in the kind of activism that you have done? Like what would be the steps that you would advise those people to take?
I think the most crucial thing is to be very clear from the word go about what your objective is, what thing you want to achieve. For one thing, that's how you then know when you've achieved it and you can stop. But also, it acts as a very good filter, because there were always things coming along to us every day. And with just 4 of us working in our spare time, it was very easy, if you're not careful, to become distracted and chase after the latest thing. And the people who are against us are very good at creating those distractions. I see this every day on Twitter, that people are chasing the latest drama that is created by somebody else and takes us away from being able to say, what is it now that we desperately need to achieve and to focus on? And nobody is focusing on it. The other thing, so that's number one. The other thing is to know how things work. We had to wise up. You know, as I started out as an IT consultant, but I had to learn how parliamentary procedure works, how laws are made, how courts operate, how the logic of the law works, and also how policies are made as well. I'm not an expert on any of those things, but I know enough to be able to hold a conversation with people who are. And if you don't know those things, then again, you can get diverted into wasting lots of energy into just railing. And I think this is the thing, particularly with the availability of online. Again, the reaction to people creating distractions is lots of blah from everybody. And it doesn't move anything. So you need to know what it is you want to achieve. And then you have to have some idea of how you are going to achieve it. Now, I'm not going to pretend that we planned all of our legal cases before they happened. They were usually the cases brought by people who came to us and asked for help because of the plight they were in. And we would say, look, if you want, we will help you to bring this case and be effective. We're also honest about saying, but it's going to take years of your life and it's going to be really hard and you're going to have to be really strong to do this. But if you want to do that, then we can use your case. But there were lots of other cases where we were saying, actually, that isn't going to advance what we want to do. But the way to help this person is to introduce them to a friendly attorney who can just use the laws as they stand to help them. And so we were able to focus on what we needed to do. So that's, I think those are the really crucial things. And the other thing, and I don't know how to tell people how to do this, is, but I think you're doing it, is to know how to motivate people, how to bring people with you, how to, and so much of my life was spent writing essays. But we created a website, but you got to have some content on it. And we were constantly filling it with new stuff and new ideas. We would take what's in the press and we would editorialize it, or we would theorize about a topic. What would happen if we did away with the entire column on the birth certificate, which is filled out when you're born, boy or girl? Why do we have that? Now, that was one of my favorite essays. Let's be really radical, rather than just say, can we have the right word on our birth certificate? Can we just blow up the whole birth certificate system? So you can really get people's minds going on that. So I think between those things, you create a community who are all interested in the goal that you've told people. They believe in the goal, and they are prepared to, when asked, to rise up and do their bit, whether it's visiting your congressman or woman, or writing a letter, or sometimes going out and protesting. But just marching down the street and shouting has a place, but it's actually not the main thing that's going to change things. So that's my advice, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, that makes a lot of sense. To be perfectly honest, a lot of my recent, like, I don't know, I spent all day sitting around thinking, just in the wake of a lot of things that have been happening. And I'm always trying to imagine, like, how to be able to mobilize people who follow me. Because the thing that's particularly hard about a lot of it is, for example, I've done, like, at this point, I've done several different forms of advocacy, one of which I've done was testifying in front of the Maryland State Congress on various bills. Like, I testified on one bill to get rid of the trans panic defense here in Maryland. And that went over very well. And I also wrote an op-ed, and I was able to get that published. And so that seems to have worked in terms of, like, advocacy. But it's also interesting because in terms of, like, getting my community really energized about that, when I make those into videos and I kind of document my process and I put that out there, it seems like people are less interested, right? And so so it's always something I'm thinking about in the back of my head, like, how do you get people excited to be able to be a part of this, right? Because a lot of people probably look at that and they see it as a daunting task, or they see it as work. It's a really interesting question. But I think that definitely some of the things that you recommended, like being able to know exactly what you want to accomplish, is very important. That connected some things in the back of my head that I was thinking about. So that was really useful. And also just, like, figuring out exactly what you don't know, right? I think that's really useful because, I mean, like, for a lot, like, for example, like on the state testimony thing, like at the beginning, I only knew that it was possible, but I didn't know how. So literally I just engaged with the process with my community. I was like, all right, we're just going to figure out how to do it, and we're going to do it. And now everyone knows how to, and they can all do it. Right. And so I definitely see the merit of that. And it's, and yeah, like, whether it's
reading... and your followers aren't homogenous. They're not all the same level of being wanting to do things. So some people can be very good administrative helpers. We had people who would copy out all the articles they found in the press, because again, we couldn't in those days copy and paste stuff because the newspapers weren't online when we started.
Right.
There was all sorts of things like that people could do, practical things, or just lick stamps and address envelopes and things like that. And there are other people who, I think you spot them fairly early on, who are people who can do the stuff that you're talking about. That they can pick up the model you've given them and they can go and apply it somewhere else. But that isn't going to be everybody who follows you. That's going to be a small caucus of people who follow you.
Right. And I suppose that the problem is, well, I mean, like and like I completely understand that. And so I think that the goal for me going forward is going to try and like get that group, whatever group that is, and try to grow that as much as possible. That makes a lot of sense. Well, hey,
Yeah.
I have to go. I have another interview.
Very, very
Thank
quick,
you.
by the way, is
Oh,
buy my book, because the
yeah.
other thing, of course, that people need to know is what their history is. Because if you don't know your history, you're not an effective campaigner. Now, there's an equivalent to that, of course, in, I'm sure you're familiar with it, Susan Stryker's book, Transgender History. And if you're really geeky about history, read the two books and actually note the similarities, because so much of our histories were before we were connected by the internet, before we were talking to each other a lot. But there are such similarities between the problems we encountered and the ways we solved them and the ways we built communities before. I remember I didn't meet Susan Stryker until 1993 at a conference in Europe. Then we were on email and then we started talking. But before then, you know, we had these separate histories. So, you know, obviously, you know, I want to sell my book, but
right.
there's also an equivalent for Canada as well. So there's you know, people have written these histories, and I think particularly for young new people in the community who want to know how to be useful.
Yeah,
that's the first start. Anyway, you got to go.
All right.
So
yes.
I'll let
Thank
you
you
go.
so much. I will talk to you later. Thank you so much. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye.